The badge was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to represent law, order, civilization creeping across an untamed frontier. When a man pinned that star to his chest, citizens slept easier. Outlaws rode harder. Justice, people believed, was finally coming to the Wild West. But what happens when the man wearing the badge is more dangerous than the criminals he's supposed to hunt? What happens when the sheriff organizing the posse is also organizing the robbery? What happens when the line between lawman and outlaw doesn't just blur, it disappears completely? These men existed. They wore badges by day and rode with bandits by night. They hunted outlaws they'd been drinking with hours earlier. They testified in court, then robbed banks before sundown. And some of them got away with it for years. This is the story of the Wild West's most corrupt lawmen, men who proved that sometimes the most dangerous criminal in town was the one carrying the warrant. Bannock, Montana Territory, January 10, 1864. A bitterly cold night. No moon, just wind howling through a mining camp that had seen too much blood. 3 men stood beneath a hastily built gallows, nooses already around their necks. One of them was Henry Plummer, the elected sheriff of Bannock, the man who was supposed to protect this town. The vigilantes didn't give him a trial. They didn't present evidence. They didn't allow him to speak in his own defense. They just pulled the rope. For 150 years, history books have told the same story. Henry Plummer was a monster. He led a secret gang called the Innocents, road agents who terrorized travelers along the Montana trails, murdering over 100 people, stealing gold by the wagon load, operating with such precision that no lawman could touch them. Why couldn't anyone stop them? Because the man leading the gang was the sheriff himself. That's the legend. But here's the problem with legends. They're often written by the people who benefited most from believing them. The vigilantes who hanged Plummer were wealthy businessmen, Republicans with political ambitions in a territory about to organize formal government. Plummer was a Democrat who openly opposed vigilantism, who associated with miners and wage workers instead of the economic elite. When they killed him, they claimed they were stopping a criminal mastermind. But the robberies didn't stop. In fact, after Plummer's death, stage holdups became more organized, more violent, more frequent. The so-called confession that damned Plummer? It came from a man named Red Yeager, a criminal being slowly strangled by the same vigilantes, desperate to say anything that might save his life. They hoisted him by the neck repeatedly until he gave them names. Plummer's name was one of them. No physical evidence ever connected Plummer to a single robbery. No stolen gold was found in his possession. No witness who wasn't facing execution ever testified against him. What we do know is this: Henry Plummer was a charismatic, well-educated man who'd been elected sheriff by popular vote. He'd applied to become a U.S. Deputy Marshal, an appointment that came through 1 week after vigilantes hanged him from the gallows he'd built for actual criminals. Was Plummer a corrupt lawman running a murder gang? Or was he a political threat eliminated by men who wrote history in their own favor? We'll never know for certain. But here's what makes his story so haunting. The vigilantes who killed him, men like Thomas Dimsdale, who wrote the only early account of Plummer's crimes, went on to become territorial judges, legislators, and founders of Montana's government. They had every reason to justify what they'd done. And for over a century, their version of events stood unchallenged. It wasn't until the 1980s that historians began finding cracks in the narrative. Court records that contradicted vigilante claims. Newspaper accounts suggesting the crime wave was exaggerated. Evidence that Plummer had actually been enforcing the law aggressively, making powerful enemies in the process. The truth about Henry Plummer may be lost to time, but his story teaches us something darker. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals in the Old West weren't the ones robbing stages. They were the ones writing the history books afterward. If Henry Plummer's guilt remains uncertain, there's no ambiguity about John Selman. He was absolutely, undeniably, spectacularly corrupt. Selman's career reads like someone deliberately trying to hit every possible category of frontier crime while occasionally pausing to pin on a badge. Confederate deserter, cattle rustler, vigilante enforcer, deputy sheriff, gang leader, town constable, and finally, the man who killed one of the West's most notorious gunfighters. Born in Arkansas in 1839, Selman joined the Confederate Army at 22, then deserted in 1863. He drifted to Texas, married, started a family, and in 1877 became a deputy Hyde inspector in Fort Griffin, a hell town so wild it made Dodge City look like a church social. His boss, Sheriff John Larn, a man with a unique approach to law enforcement. Control the vigilantes, rustle cattle on the side, and occasionally shoot people who ask too many questions. Selman and Larn didn't just bend the law, they turned it into a profit center. They rustled livestock from neighboring ranches, sold the cattle to the U.S. Army garrison, then used their badges to intimidate anyone who complained. It worked beautifully, until it didn't. In June 1878, vigilantes locked Sheriff Larn in his own jail and shot him to death through the bars. Even though Selman wasn't in town that day, he was implicated in the cattle thefts. Suddenly, the vigilantes he'd once controlled were hunting him. Selman fled to New Mexico and organized a gang called Selman Scouts, a group accused of murder, rape, and robbery throughout Lincoln County during the late 1870s. They operated with such brutality that even in a region torn apart by the Lincoln County War, Selman Scouts stood out as particularly vicious. When Texas Rangers finally captured him in 1880, Selman escaped custody and disappeared into Mexico. He stayed gone for 8 years. When he returned to the United States in 1888, Selman had somehow reinvented himself again. He settled in El Paso, married a young woman named Romula Granadine, and worked as a town constable while supplementing his income through gambling. Children in El Paso remembered Uncle John as the kindly constable who handed out candy as he walked his rounds. Citizens of Lincoln County remembered him as the leader of a gang that made Billy the Kid look civilized. On April 5, 1894, Selman found himself in the middle of a chaotic gunfight at a brothel called Tilly Howard's. A drunken Texas Ranger named Bass Outlaw had accidentally discharged his weapon, and when lawmen arrived to calm him down, Outlaw shot Ranger Joe McKittrick in the head, killing him instantly. Outlaw then turned his gun on Selman. Powder burns scarred Selman's skin and permanently damaged his night vision. Selman returned fire, hitting Outlaw above the heart. Outlaw fired back twice more, hitting Selman in the leg before staggering into the street and dying 4 hours later. A judge ruled it self-defense. Selman walked free. But the event that made John Selman infamous happened 14 months later, on August 19, 1895. That night, Selman walked into the Acme Saloon in El Paso and shot John Wesley Hardin in the back of the head, while Hardin was rolling dice at the bar. Hardin, a gunfighter credited with killing anywhere from 20 to 40 men, died instantly. Selman fired 3 more rounds into his body as he fell. Why did Selman kill him? The official story involves Hardin's girlfriend, an arrest by Selman's son, and an argument earlier that day. But some historians believe Selman was hired to eliminate Hardin, who'd been causing problems for powerful men in El Paso. Selman was arrested and charged with murder. A hung jury couldn't reach a verdict. He was released on bond, pending retrial. He never made it back to court. On April 5, 1896, exactly 2 years to the day after he'd killed Bass Outlaw, Selman got into an argument with U.S. Deputy Marshal George Scarborough outside the Wigwam Saloon. The argument escalated, guns were drawn, Scarborough shot Selman 4 times. John Selman died on the operating table the next morning. He was buried in an unmarked grave in El Paso's Concordia Cemetery. Historians estimate he killed between 12 and 30 men during his life, some while wearing a badge, some while running from the law, and some in that murky gray zone where the two overlapped completely. Scarborough, the man who killed him, died 4 years later in a gunfight with cattle rustlers. Violence, it seemed, was a debt that always came due. If John Selman was brutal, Bert Alvord was brazen. Where Selman operated in the shadows, Alvord pulled off one of the most audacious schemes in Wild West history. He robbed trains while serving as the town constable, then organized posses to hunt himself. And he almost got away with it. Born in California in 1867, Alvord grew up in Tombstone, Arizona, working at the OK Corral during the town's most violent years. He learned early that in the Wild West, survival meant being tougher than the next guy. Alvord was very tough. He had fists like hammers and a reputation for fearlessness. Sheriff John Slaughter hired him as a deputy, describing him as a man who didn't know the meaning of the word fear. Slaughter also joked that Alvord didn't know the meaning of a lot of other words either. Alvord had never attended school and could barely read. But what Alvord lacked in education, he made up for in cunning. In 1897, the rough mining town of Wilcox, Arizona, needed a constable who could handle rowdy cowboys and enforce order. They hired Alvord. He was perfect for the job. Strong, fearless, well-liked. Within months, he'd pacified the town's toughest troublemakers. Everything was going great, except Alvord was bored and broke. Constable wages weren't impressive. So he decided to rob trains on the side. His plan was ingenious in its simplicity. He would use his position as constable to create perfect alibis while his deputies did the actual robbing. Then, when the alarm was raised, he'd lead the posse hunting for criminals he'd personally instructed. On September 9, 1899, Alvord put his plan into action. That night, as a Southern Pacific train approached Cochise Station just outside Wilcox, Alvord was sitting in the back room of Schwertner's saloon playing poker with 3 drinking buddies, Billy Stiles, Matt Burtz, and Bill Downing. Except they weren't really there. Every few minutes, a bartender carried drinks into the back room and emerged with empty glasses, loudly announcing to the bar that Constable Alvord and his friends were having a serious game and didn't want to be disturbed. Meanwhile, Stiles and Burtz were 10 miles away, climbing aboard the slowing train with guns drawn. The robbery went flawlessly. They got away with several $1,000s in cash and gold. When the train backed into Wilcox and the alarm was raised, someone suggested they fetch Constable Alvord from the saloon. Alvord emerged from the back room, feigning shock. "Great Scott!" he shouted, pointing at his 3 poker partners. "I need volunteers for a posse. You, and you." The 4 men, 3 of whom had just committed the robbery, rode off into the night to hunt the bandits. The next morning, they returned to town, claiming they'd lost the trail in the darkness. A few eyebrows were raised. Rumors floated around Wilcox. But Alvord deflected suspicion with humor, joking that everyone knew he was too dumb to pull off such a clever crime. For months it looked like he'd gotten away with it. Then Alvord made a critical mistake. He tried it again. On February 15, 1900, 5 members of the Alvord gang attempted to rob a train at Fairbanks Station. What they didn't know was that the Wells Fargo messenger that day wasn't the regular employee. It was Jeff Milton, a legendary ex-Texas Ranger and one of the toughest lawmen in the West. When the bandits opened fire, Milton grabbed a shotgun and returned fire with devastating effect. He hit gang member Bravo Juan Yoas in the seat of the pants and mortally wounded 3-fingered Jack Dunlap. As Dunlap lay dying, he gave up the entire operation. He named Alvord as the mastermind. He detailed both robberies. He exposed the poker alibi, the hidden dynamite, the buried loot. Wells Fargo finally had the evidence they needed. Bert Alvord was arrested, tried and convicted. But even imprisonment couldn't hold him. He escaped from jail twice, once with the help of Billy Stiles, who broke him out and later mailed the jail keys back as a joke. Alvord was recaptured by Arizona Rangers in 1904 and sent to Yuma Territorial Prison. He served 2 years, was released, and promptly vanished. Some say he died of fever in Barbados around 1910. Others claim he fled to Central America and bought a cattle ranch with the loot from his robberies, money that was never recovered. Old-timers in Wilcox like to joke that if Alvord did buy that ranch, he probably branded his cattle with WF for Wells Fargo, his unwilling benefactors. After all, Burt Alvord always did have a sense of humor. These three men, Plummer, Selman, and Alvord, represent a darker truth about the Wild West that doesn't make it into most history books. The frontier wasn't a simple morality play with heroes in white hats and villains in black. It was a chaotic, violent, lawless world where the line between lawman and outlaw was often invisible, where badges could be bought, elections rigged, and justice served at the end of a rope without trial. Henry Plummer may have been innocent, a sheriff murdered by vigilantes, who then rewrote history to justify their crime. John Selman was definitely guilty, a career criminal who wore a badge when it suited him and discarded it when it didn't, leaving a trail of bodies that stretched across 3 decades. Burt Alvord was brazenly guilty, a man so confident in his scheme that he literally led posses to hunt himself, turning law enforcement into theater. But they all shared one thing. They understood that in the Wild West, the badge wasn't a symbol of justice. It was a tool, a weapon, a shield against accountability. When you controlled the law, you controlled everything. Some used that power to bring order to chaos. Others used it to rob, steal, and kill with impunity. And the scariest part? For years, sometimes decades, no one could tell the difference. Remember, sometimes the most dangerous man in town wasn't the one riding into the sunset. It was the one handing out badges,